Smite! Hello everyone. So you may have seen the big news in the last week or so is that Hasbro are re-releasing a version of the classic, the original dungeon bashing board game, Heroquest. So fairly predictably, I'm not all that bothered or impressed. Basically, well, you can't get it in the UK anyway, so it's not even a consideration. There may be a release next year, they've said, but it's the same price as a second-hand copy on eBay is currently at, and quite honestly, I think the artwork is pretty terrible. I think the miniatures are horrible. So I don't see why I would be in any way, shape, or form interested. I mean, look, this beautiful artwork, you know, Les Edwards oil painting, just stunning work, lovely artwork. And the Hasbro one has this sort of World of Warcraft, the uber high fantasy, strange, kind of cartoony look and feel to it. And it just completely changes the atmosphere, even though the board is more or less the same and the treasure cards are pretty similar, and as far as I can tell, the rules are the same. It's just that change of artwork changes the mood of it to the extent that I'm not bothered. But rather than sit here and bitch and moan about how crappy the Hasbro board game is because I don't need to buy it, you know, I've got I've got this original set, so it really is of no interest to me. And if people like it and want to pick it up because they don't have a version of the original, then great, excellent. I'm glad they've got the chance to do it, although it is the same price as an original on eBay. So, you know, get yourselves an original. But rather than moan about it, I thought I would take this opportunity to talk about something that I have a conversation with a few people at shows about, and have been part of several online chats about, and that is the whole analog versus digital thing. So all of the art in the new Hasbro is digital. And if you go into a game shop and you were to see that on the shelf, it would be the same kind of style, same kind of visual aesthetic, same use of very poppy, bright colours as every other game on the shelves in that shop. And you know, really that has become the staple, the go-to, is to use digital artwork of that very high fantasy style, which is very kind of computer gamey. It feels like, and some people have compared it with Final Fantasy. I think Final Fantasy has its own aesthetic per game, although I'm not a big computer game fan, so I don't really know that much about the Final Fantasy. I've just sort of seen the box art from various editions, and it all looks very varied to me. But certainly this sort of crazy, ridiculous armor. I mean, it feels like when I mean, okay, this era is a bit more sort of sword and sorcery. It's a bit more, you know, Boris Vallejo kind of style. Very Conan the Adventurer. This is definitely Conan the Adventurer influenced for sure. But this and prior to this, there's this very low fantasy vibe. Certainly in things like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, it's a bit gritty, it's a bit dirty. In fact, it's very dirty. You know, you're not playing these big nobles. You're playing the scum of the earth, dregs of society, trying to make it in a rough world that's going to kill you. And yeah, there's fantasy stylings to the weapons, but they're recognisably medieval or dark age weaponry and armour that has slightly different ornamentation on it. It's come from Tolkien, and it's come from um, companies that were doing historical miniatures moving into fantasy. And Tolkien writes in his essay on fairy stories that if you want to make a fantasy that is grounded and that is believable, you have to make it quite close to people's experience, close to people's reality. And so it needs to have aspects that are recognisable. So Tolkien took bits of Anglo-Saxon and put them in there, bits of Victoriana and put them in there, bits of medieval and put them in there. And he's creating this world that is a mashup of all these different influences and sources, but it's a world that very definitely has borders. So it has dragons, and it has Balrogs, and it has trolls, and on a later video we might talk about why that is. But if a Pegasus, say, or a Griffin were to land in the middle of the Pelennor Fields, it would look completely out of place. It would break the world, because Tolkien has set these clear boundaries. Like, this is what is possible within this world, and there is magic, and there are these mysterious mythical creatures, but they're mythical creatures that are drawn from particular sources that have a particular feel to it, and you would break that if you were to stick too many fantastical mythical beasts in there. But the fantasy scene seems to have really moved away from that to become very escapist and trying to do away with as much reality as possible, and bring in all of these creatures from all over the place. And so you now have an artwork that, instead of being rooted in sort of realism, this is, the subject matter is not realistic, but the style of painting is very, very realistic. Whereas with a lot of the digital art, and even the hand-drawn art, I guess, that's around now, a lot of it is fantasy layered upon fantasy. So it's gone from low fantasy to high fantasy, and then it's gone to fantasy that is based on more fantasy rather than fantasy that is based on reality. So you've got huge, ridiculous swords in the sword and sorcery era that look cool, but are based on real weaponry. The current trend seems to be to take the fantasy sword and further fantasify it to the point where it stops looking cool. You don't mind that you wouldn't be able to wield it effectively if it looks cool, because it's fantasy, it's not real. But it goes beyond looking like it's a cool fantasy to it's just ridiculous, it's just weird having something that's as tall as a person, just hefted over your shoulder, and it's got a tiny head. And yes, I am talking about the Hasbro Barbarian in this sense. But so there's a definite shift in aesthetic, and that is what fundamentally bothers me. It's not per se because it's digital art, it's because the digital art seems to embody that kind of style. Now, I made a very definite decision with the woods that I wasn't going to have any. There is one piece of digital art in the woods. Other than that, everything is hand done, everything is analog, and all of the sculpting, without exception, all of the sculpting is analog. And I come from a prop making background, from a model making background, and I regularly use laser cutters, 3D printers, CNC routers. They're just tools, and they do a job, and they do a very useful job, especially when you're up against timescales and budget restraints and that kind of thing. So I'm absolutely not anti-digital sculpting, anti-digital painting. It's just tools, and there are times when you use the tools and there are times when you don't use the tools. And for the woods, I've made a very definite decision not to use any digital tools. Partly because I actually want to stand out, and when people come to see the stand at shows, or when people see the cover of the Woods on a shop bookshelf, I want people to go, oh, you know, that's a bit different, because the market is so saturated at the moment with digital, and it's only going to get more saturated with digital. That's the way that it goes, and the more people churn out in plastic, the more sense it makes to go into digital, because it's much easier to mold from that. And we'll come back to the positives of using it as a tool. But partly I wanted to stand out, so using a different technique to the norm is a good way of standing out. But there's something more to it as well. Like, when people describe handcrafted stuff, particularly if they've got rose-tinted goggles and nostalgia, and you know, I get all of that, but the only way they can tend to describe something is as it having character or it having soul. And this is a bit of an abstract concept, because obviously it's a bit of metal or it's a bit of plastic. It doesn't have a soul. It's not a living thing. But I think there is something with that physical, that it's always had physical contact. It's been a person carving a thing that has then gone into a mold that has then come out, and it's a tactile thing. This is why I didn't ever really get on with computer games, because I need to have that need to be tactile. I need to be working on something that I can move around in all dimensions, and I can see it, and I can sort of experience it. And I think we do still feel some kind of connection to something that is tactile. And if you want to get really romantic about it, our primitive ancestors millennia ago were sat in caves carving bone. And what we're doing here is essentially no different. And yeah, we're using putty, we're not using bone. Then it's going into a rubber mould rather than into hot sand. And then we're casting it in pewter, in lead, not in bronze. But essentially they're the same processes and the same techniques that people have used for millennia. And I'm not somebody who says that tradition dictates what we should do. I think there are traditions that we need to look at and question and be, you know, recognise why they're there and what they actually mean, and say, okay, this is good, this is not so good, let's look at this, let's not look at this. But I think let's not throw or forget that sense of tradition is there. It's very romantic to say that this is a connection to Bronze Age ancestors living in huts and making little bronze torques and amulets and all the rest of it. But you know, there is something to that. And if you're into fantasy gaming, I've got to assume that kind of romantic view of the distant past is something that you you might subscribe to, at least from time to time. The other reason is that there are limitations when you're doing a physical sculpt. So your eyesight is only so good, and having good lighting is important. And sometimes you use magnification. I hate using magnification because it throws my depth of perception to hell. But you know, we're going to have to use magnification at some point. Yeah, but your eyesight is only so good. And you're using a scalpel or a pin or a rubber chisel tip tool, and they're only so fine. You know, there is only so sharp a point you can get on that to work the material with. With the digital sculpting, you can zoom into the nth degree. You know, you could sculpt individual hairs if you wanted to. They wouldn't necessarily cast, and that's something that a lot of people who've picked up on digital sculpting for themselves fall down on, because they don't quite understand how the other side of it works. But that's not a knock at the digital process by itself. There are some extremely good digital sculptors who sculpt in a way that you wouldn't know whether it was digitally done or hand done or not. They're able to break from the conventions. but because you can zoom in, because you can get so much detail in, the tendency is to overladen something with details, and at the same time to leave lots of smooth surfaces, because you can get really smooth with the digital sculpts, especially if you're just you're working with stock shapes and pulling them around and creating meshes. You can smooth out a huge amount, and so you can refine and you can make things perfectly smooth, and you can make details perfectly sharp and perfectly crisp, and absolutely tiny, tiny details. But there's something in that sense of doing something perfectly that feels wrong. And it's a thing that we find in society with sort of airbrushed celebrity photos and things that are not perfect being made to look perfect, being given this illusion of perfection. And because real life isn't perfect, unless you're sculpting in those imperfections, which is an art form to itself, and I would suggest that that's why some digital sculptors are really, really good, because they know when to sculpt in these imperfections. You can create something that looks very artificial because you've reflected the sides possibly, it's too symmetrical, it's too accurate, it's too sharp, and it just doesn't look real. It doesn't look like it could be connected to the real world, which is something that I think is particularly important in say believable fantasy settings. You know what I mean? They're not believable, but they mean that you could step into the world and feel yourself in the world in a way that something that looks artificial doesn't enable you to do. And this principle of perfection. There's a Japanese, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but there's a principle called wabi sabi, which is where Japanese culture, they are very, very precise. They are so precise. Everything is done to pinpoint precision. But there is a principle that says that nothing should be perfect. So you'll find an intentionally placed little flaw. Something will be intentionally just a little bit out of place, to reflect that actually life isn't perfect, and that's a philosophical thing, to say the world is not perfect, life isn't perfect. The thing that you make should not be perfect, and I would not claim that I could achieve perfection in any case. But I think there's something profound. Yeah, okay. There's something profound about not striving for absolute perfection and saying, do you know what? Things are as they are. Let's get this good enough, but let's not worry if it's not totally perfect. The other thing that happens if you've got very, very fine detail and big smooth areas is that it is a bugger to paint. Now, I have this big philosophy with painting that a good sculpt should look good on the table if painted by a mediocre painter. I'm not a brilliant painter. I'm all right. I'm getting better, but I'm not interested in learning non-metallic metal techniques. I'm not interested in refining to be as good as a lot of the professional miniatures painters are. What I'm interested in is something that looks good on the table. So I will wash and I will dry brush, and I will pick out choice highlights, and that will be enough. So I would say I'm very much a mediocre painter in that respect. And I think it's very sad if you've got a miniature that is, it's got lots of smooth surfaces that you need to be very, very good at wet blending in order to make that work, or you need to be very good with an airbrush to make that work, and really fine details that you need a really steady hand and a really good eye and really thin paint and the right thinners and the right inks to pick out all of those details and make the most of all of those details. And so many times you see these very, very finely sculpted digital models that just look terrible because they're so hard to paint nicely. And Games Workshop have cottoned onto this, and their new contrast paints that are a lot like strong washes, I guess, midway between a wash and an ink, goes a long way to help, I guess, from their perspective, advertising-wise, to help that stop there being these bad-looking digital sculpts on the tabletop. But you still see it time and time again. So I think a really good miniature should paint itself. And that to me means having lots of texture on it. And texture is something that is very easy to do by hand. You pull out and it's very easy. It's very easy to make a texture. It's very hard to make that texture look like what it is. That's another art form in itself. But you can pull out fur, and you can pull down hair, and you can jab chainmail, and create these textures that all take washes and dry brushes in slightly different ways, so that you end up with these different surfaces, these different textures across the miniature. And even if you're not a very good painter, that helps bring it to life, helps it to stand out on the table. So that's partly my philosophy, and I think that's easier to do with an analog sculpt. There's also the sense of proportion. A lot of digital sculptors have come at this from action figure sculpting, or they have come at this from some other field other than becoming a wargames sculptor. And so when they sculpt a figure, they sculpt it proportionally perfect. But going back to what I say about the fineness of tools and the degree to which your eyesight works, because you can resize stuff left, right, and centre in digital work, you don't always necessarily get a sense of how big it is when it comes out on the tabletop. And if you've got a 28mm figure, the head is really small, especially if you're doing it in true proportion. So the historical miniatures still today have very accurate proportions, a lot of them, although some of them are moving into the kind of fantasy proportions. But fantasy miniatures, from the time when they became used as role-playing miniatures, they needed to have expressive faces and expressive hands, because these are people's characters that are taken there, and you want them to look like the characters and to play like the characters, so the expression is really important. So heads ended up being bigger, and hands ended up being bigger in relation to the body. I think Brian Ansell said that the Wargames figures, when they were working with Asgard and Early Citadel, they were 5 heads into the body, whereas it's 7 to 8 on a normal in proportion adult. So it's quite a lot. If you scale it up, it would look really weird. But it reads on the tabletop because you look at the face and you look at the surrounding that it's in. Generally, people don't spend a lot of time looking at an elbow. They spend a lot of time looking at the head of the miniature. So this sense of proportion, I'm not saying digital sculptors don't know this sense of proportion, it's just that a lot of digital sculptors who come from other sculpting fields aren't aware that that's the case. So you end up with these very proportionally accurate figures. You see it particularly, I guess, in superhero miniatures. Very proportionately accurate, but they look so weird in contrast with everything that we're used to seeing, because we're used to seeing stuff with exaggerated features and exaggerated proportions, so that we can read it. There's also this issue of posing. So because you can create a digital model in an environment, and then you can chop it however you need to chop it for moulding, and very accurately with no loss. If you chop a physical model, you lose the width of the scalpel blade, you lose the width of the saw blade, you lose a little bit every time you chop it. And sometimes it's not enough to notice, but sometimes you have to then bulk it out a bit, otherwise it looks odd when it goes back together. You don't have to worry about that with digital stuff, particularly useful for injection moulding, of course, because then you're casting a rigid material into a rigid mould. And so in order to have a dynamic pose, you need to have it in multiple pieces. And personally, I cannot stand multi-part miniatures. I really hate them. I try personally to do things as single parts whenever I can, so that they are whole, intact pieces. They're not going to fall apart, the super glue's not going to give out, they're not going to fall off a shelf and their arm comes off and goes under the skirting board and you can't find it, that kind of thing. For collectors' miniatures and display miniatures, okay, assemble it, put it on a display stand, paint it, job done, good, don't touch it. But for gaming miniatures, where you're handling miniatures all the time, I hate multi-part figures. And that seems to be this big trend that now, because you can do multi-part much easier, lots of people are doing multi-part, and they're doing these, you know, very extreme dynamic poses that you could never do with a two-part vulcanized mold. It wouldn't work. But that results in figures that I hate because I hate assembling them, and B, that results in a loss of creativity in one respect, because you don't have that creative restriction of having to make an interesting pose that works in essentially 2 dimensions. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. You know, all the miniatures that are doing this, because you can do that in 2 dimensions really easily. But you look at the early Nick Lund stuff, some of the posing, some of the really twisted orcs and goblins, are done in such a way to really make use of that limitation that you've only got this 2-dimensional thing. So that I think sparks creativity in a way that if you're totally free to do whatever you like, you haven't got that inspiration to do that. I mentioned the perfection thing. The other thing that you can do, of course, with digital sculpting is that you can undo stuff. So if you get it wrong, it's easy to step backwards through it and undo it or tweak it. If you get something wrong with a physical model, you know, you're hacking limbs off and replacing them to try and undo it. It's a lot harder. So you have to put a lot more time and energy into getting it right first time, and then you have to work with the mistakes, which is also, you know, it's a limiting challenge, but it's a challenge that I think sort of is interesting and is creative and motivates you to be a problem solver and to overcome these problems. So I did say it's a tool, and I'm totally happy to use it as a tool. There are instances where I would definitely use it. So if I go back to the Factious Waste range, I think actually the vibe of that kind of futuristic look works really well for 3D printing. And I probably wouldn't do the figures, but what I might do is do the guns, the weapons, the accessories as resin cast pieces, or, you know, cast them in resin, cast them in metal, use them to fit to the bodies. Because you've got this ability to size it however you need it to be. So if you print out the gun and you think, oh, that's a little bit too big, print it out again smaller, oh, it's a bit too small, split the difference. You can get that sizing in a way that's a lot easier than if you're trying to sculpt and file it down and shape it and work on really small bits. So then I would definitely go back to use it. It does have its benefits and its positives. It's just, I think you've got to be a bit selective where you use it and not go to it as your go-to solution. So sorry, that has been a bit of a rant, but I hope it's been useful. I hope it sparked some ideas, and you might completely disagree with me. You know, this is just my take on it. So I have got my Heroquest board out here, and what I thought that I might do is have a look at, because I mentioned, you know, the prices on eBay are quite high, and the price of the Hasbro one, even if you could get it where you are, is quite high still. I thought I might take a look and see if there's a way of doing a vintage Heroquest set for the same price or a little bit less. So, you know, see if we can find the miniatures, the doors, the scenery, the board, the thing. See if we fit all the components together and see what it actually comes to. I think it will probably be actually more expensive than getting your hands on a classic copy, even if the classic copy is 80, 100, 120 pounds, whatever. But it might be just interesting to take a look at. So maybe we'll do that next week. So in the meantime, take care of yourselves and stay safe.